What if the recent disappearance of 5 Boeing 747 cargo planes could change the course of global politics? Delve with us into this perplexing mystery, exploring the connection between China, Iran, and the stakes of international power as tensions rise in a fragile region. You're about to uncover the secrets behind these vanishing flights and what they could mean for the future of energy security and military alliances. In a perplexing turn of events, 5 China-registered Boeing 747 cargo planes have seemingly vanished from radar screens near Iranian airspace, sparking a flurry of speculation and concern among geopolitical analysts. The timing of these disappearances occurring shortly after Israeli airstrikes on Iranian territory has only amplified suspicions surrounding the nature of their cargo and their intended destination. The aircraft, originating from various locations in China, embarked on their respective journeys on June 15, 16, and 17. Their flight paths initially took them over the vast expanse of northern China, followed by stretches across Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. However, as they approached Iranian airspace, the planes mysteriously disappeared from radar, leaving no trace of their whereabouts. According to official flight plans, the cargo planes were supposedly en route to various destinations in Europe. However, none of the aircraft ever reached their intended destinations, further fueling suspicions about their true purpose, given the known capabilities of these heavy-duty freighters to transport substantial military equipment. The disappearances have prompted speculation about potential covert arms transfers to Iran, while it is crucial to acknowledge that these flights could have been entirely innocent, perhaps victims of digital anomalies or technical malfunctions. The coincidental timing and the sensitive nature of the region make it difficult to dismiss the possibility of something more clandestine at play, although there is no concrete evidence to definitively confirm that the aircraft landed in Iran. The speculation surrounding their disappearance is not entirely without merit. China has compelling reasons to support Iran, given the significant economic ties between the two nations. A substantial portion of China's seaborne crude oil imports, as much as 16%, originates from Iran. Furthermore, when considering the entire Gulf region, this figure rises to a staggering 53%. Therefore, any event that destabilizes Iran's energy infrastructure or disrupts the flow of oil through the Strait of Hormuz would have far-reaching consequences, potentially affecting China's energy security and economic stability. If Israel were to launch a large-scale military operation targeting Iran's energy infrastructure, or if the Strait of Hormuz were to be blocked, the repercussions would extend far beyond Tehran, potentially reverberating all the way to Beijing. Such a scenario would undoubtedly present a significant challenge to China's economic interests, a cost that Beijing would likely be unwilling to accept without a response. However, the strategic implications extend even further. If the conflict between Israel and Iran were to escalate, drawing in the United States, it could inadvertently create a window of opportunity for China to advance its own strategic objectives. A prolonged conflict in Iran would inevitably divert U.S. attention and resources, forcing Washington into a protracted engagement that it had not anticipated and from which it would be difficult to extricate itself. Every dollar that the United States spends fighting in Iran would be one less dollar available to deter China's ambitions in the Asia-Pacific region, as Washington becomes increasingly entangled in another seemingly endless war. China would be free to concentrate on its primary objective, Taiwan. It is important to emphasize that this analysis is not intended to single out China for criticism. The United States, if placed in a similar situation, might very well pursue a similar course of action. From a purely pragmatic realpolitik perspective, the unfolding situation in the Middle East could represent the opportunity that Beijing has been waiting for, and it may not present itself again. Ultimately, China's most potent weapon may be the United States' limited attention span and its tendency to become embroiled in protracted conflicts. Advertisement for supremacy. World War III. Throughout much of its post-revolutionary history, Iran has struggled to find reliable great power to align with. For a period, it appeared that Russia might fill this role. However, Moscow has proven to be an unreliable partner, often making promises of advanced air defense systems and combat aircraft that were either delivered late or not at all. One of the primary reasons for Russia's hesitancy is its desire not to jeopardize its relationship with Israel. Despite the complexities of the situation, Russian-Israeli ties run deeper than many realize. Over 1 million Israelis speak Russian, and the two countries have coordinated military operations in Syria. Furthermore, their defense industries maintain discrete channels of cooperation behind the scenes. In short, Russia has too much to lose by fully committing to Iran's caused this atmosphere of mistrust is reciprocated by Iran, which has consistently sought to maintain open relations with Europe through trade diplomacy and energy cooperation. Consequently, Iran's regional goals have often clashed with Russia's, particularly in the Caucasus. Central Asia, as a result, their alliance is built more on short-term convenience than on long-term commitment. China, on the other hand, appears to be following a different strategy. If Beijing chooses to deepen its involvement in the region, the groundwork is already in place. China has no colonial history in the Middle East, no historical baggage, and no overlapping territorial ambitions. Its primary interests are oil trade and influence. And it is willing to invest for the long term to achieve these goals. In 2021, Iran and China signed a 25-year partnership agreement that went far beyond symbolic diplomacy. The agreement outlined long-term cooperation in various sectors, including energy infrastructure, telecommunications, and military development at its core. The deal provides China with guaranteed access to Iranian oil at discounted rates, while offering Iran billions of dollars in investment tied to the Belt and Road Initiative. It also paves the way for Chinese involvement in Iranian ports, railways, and digital networks. For Iran, the deal represents a means to survive isolation and mitigate the effects of international sanctions. For China, it is an opportunity to establish a firm foothold in the Middle East without resorting to military force. China's influence extends beyond the economic sphere, encompassing strategic considerations, as well. Consider the situation in Syria, where backed Assad at a time when the United States and Europe were calling for regime change. Support was not motivated by loyalty, but by cold calculation. Assad was isolated and under pressure, and propping him up gave a foothold in a collapsing state. Weak allies, after all, are easier to control. China appears to be adopting a similar strategy. Today, whether it chooses to implement it remains to be seen. Iran has suffered significant blows from Israel, but it has not yet collapsed, at least not entirely. Moment of true vulnerability may be approaching, and that is when China could potentially step in, not to save Iran unconditionally, but to reshape it through deals, loans, and weapons that come with strings attached. Iran would not become a Chinese satellite overnight, but it could be gradually nudged into a position of dependence, indebtedness, and strategic usefulness. Admittedly, much of this premise relies on circumstances that are still unfolding. However, if any country is well positioned to capitalize on this conflict, it is China. Every war attracts new participants, and the longer the conflict between Israel and Iran persists, the more likely it is that outside powers will become involved. For China, this presents both a risk and an opportunity. A short war would leave Beijing watching from the sidelines. However, a prolonged conflict, particularly one that draws in the United States, could create an opening for China to act. If the United States intervenes militarily, engaging in full-scale sustained combat, and Iran manages to withstand the initial onslaught without collapsing entirely, China could quietly provide support in the form of combat aircraft, air defenses, guided missiles, and satellite assistance technologies that Iran either lacks or produces in limited quantities. If this support were to flow in discreetly and consistently, Iran could potentially become a source of ongoing conflict for the United States, mirroring the situation in Ukraine, where the U.S. has supported a proxy war against Russia. To be clear, this material support would not necessarily guarantee victory for Iran, but it would prolong the hostilities, which may be the ultimate objective. China does not necessarily need Iran to win the war. It simply needs Iran to survive and drain U.S. resources. This would stretch America's political capital and logistical capabilities, creating a conflict with no clear exit strategy. A drawn-out conflict of this nature would play directly into Beijing's hands, not because China cares about the Middle East ideology, international law, or even Iran, but because it buys time. A distracted United States provides Beijing with breathing room in East Asia, allowing it to focus its efforts on Taiwan while Washington is preoccupied with another seemingly endless war. China can strengthen its naval posture, test responses around Taiwan, and shape global narratives. A distracted America offers Beijing its best chance to make a move on Taiwan. Washington simply cannot sustain two major confrontations simultaneously, especially if one of them devolves into a slow grinding campaign. Beijing would not even need to act immediately. The mere fact that Washington is bogged down in the Middle East shifts the strategic landscape. Naturally, this outcome would depend on how long the U.S. remains engaged and how discreetly Beijing plays its hand. However, it would represent an once-in-a-generation opportunity for China to reshape the balance of power in the Asia-Pacific region. While America is focused elsewhere, however, every lifeline comes with a leash. If Iran accepts Chinese support, it will not be free. Just as Assad became dependent on Iran, and Russia to remain in power, Iran may be forced into a similar role this time. As China's proxy, once that shift occurs, Iran may find that it is no longer in control of its own destiny. Should Iran come to rely on Chinese weapons financing and diplomatic cover, Beijing will expect influence in return, not total control, but enough to shape Iran's decisions and pull the strings when it matters most. This would place Iran in a precarious position. Foreign backing might help it survive the war, but it would come at the cost of its strategic autonomy. The clearest example of this is the Strait of Hormuz. Iran's ability to threaten global oil shipments through the strait is one of its strongest deterrents. However, if China becomes its patron, that option may disappear. Approximately half of China's crude oil imports originate from the Gulf region, depends on those same oil flows through the Strait of Hormuz, and would not tolerate disruptions to its own energy security. In other words, Iran's greatest strength could become off-limits, not because it lacks the capability to act, but because it no longer has the authority to do so. That is the paradox of becoming a proxy. Survival comes at the cost of independence. The more Iran relies on China, the more it risks being treated the way Assad was treated by Iran, and Russia kept afloat, but closely controlled decisions regarding war, trade, and foreign policy would increasingly be made in Beijing. For a revolutionary state that has long prided itself on its sovereignty, that may be the hardest price to pay. However, if the circumstances align, Beijing may already be preparing for what comes next. The truth is, most forever wars start with a timeline, but inevitably miss it. What do you think happened to these cargo planes? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more intriguing stories.